It's no surprise that we have a natural instinct to seek out and bond with social groups. But now we have, in a modern context, we have so many types to choose from now, and so much access, especially through the internet. It really has a very unique moment in our history that we have the opportunity to connect with as many different tribal groups as we can. I think that probably is a source of confusion for us.
Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of the Living and Leading with Emotional Intelligence podcast/show. I'm your host, Brittney-Nichole. Today's guest is coming to you from Canada. Kevin deLaplante is an independent educator and consultant specializing in critical thinking education and training for individuals, institutions, and businesses. I found Kevin on YouTube, which I will talk about a little bit later into the podcast as I was doing some research for my book. And I fell in love with his content because it was both informative and visual. So as a kid, Kevin was interested in the arts and sciences and thought seriously about becoming a professional cartoonist, which is reflected in his content creation. And Kevin has a bachelor's in physics, a master's and a PhD in philosophy, and I love the way he breaks down somewhat complicated issues and human behaviors and objectively analyzes them. And that's what I love about philosophy. So I'm very excited to bring him to you as a guest today so you can learn from him as we talk about tribalism and how that plays into how we interact with each other, biases, and developing that self-awareness and understanding about tribalism so that we can incorporate that into our awareness when developing our emotional intelligence. I'm going to halt the brakes here for just a second. If you enjoy this podcast, and especially this episode, I think you would really find some value in the book that I just completed called the EQ Deficiency, where we talk about all of this stuff. And there's some quotes and information that I pulled from Kevin's content as well in the book. You can find that on Amazon. It's available in hardback, paperback, and ebook version. Now, without further ado, here is Kevin deLaplante. Well, hello, Kevin, again.
Hello.
Thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to interview you about this. Again, I came across your work probably a year and a half ago now before I started writing the book. I was doing my research on tribalism and the correlation between emotional intelligence, so being self-aware, and how tribalism plays into our biases and how we interact with individuals. And I think you have amazing content on YouTube, and I found it other places as well, but you do a great job of illustrating and explaining tribalism among other human behaviors. So before we dive into that, can you tell the audience, just in your own words, a little bit about yourself?
Sure, and thank you for that introduction. I used to be an academic philosopher. I taught at Iowa State University for 16 years, and there I mostly taught philosophy of science and ethics and some general topics in the philosophy of ecology and some other fields. But I left that career about 5 years ago because I wanted to do more kind of public outreach, public philosophy, education. And I think I always had that intent in mind to do that. When I started off in my academic career, I had intended on leaving at some point to shift gears and work in a more public venue. I started creating these videos while I was in academic teaching. They initially started out as just support videos for like flipped classroom teaching, where you'd teach, record a lecture so your students could see it when they're not in the classroom, and you could spend more time in the classroom doing discussion and quizzing and other sorts of things. And then when I had enough of these built up, I had the idea maybe putting them up on YouTube or putting up on membership site. So those videos start way back, probably 12 years ago now. The more recent videos on tribalism came about sort of as after the 2016 election. It was after that, and there was a lot of new reporting on the state of political discourse, especially in the American context, but it was also kind of more broadly around the world, a shift towards the right in terms of politics, and a lot more polarization among social groups, liberals and conservatives, or Democrats and Republicans, and a lot more animosity and hostility and suspicion of each side. And I realized this was a really important problem from a critical thinking standpoint, just from an ability to sort of, if you cared about, having true beliefs, not having false beliefs, if you cared about making wise decisions, and if you cared about being able to think for yourself, being an independent critical thinker, those are my three primary critical thinking values. Then you should care about the state of discourse and polarization and sort of the tribal psychology that's underpinning it, because that affects our ability to identify, recognize true beliefs, eliminate false ones, make wise decisions, and it affects our ability to think for ourselves. Yep. So every single pillar of that thing is impacted by the state of our social environment and the freedom that we feel to think or argue about different topics. So I thought it was important to address that and talk about that. And then that project kind of took on a life of its own. So that's a part of the story. The other part of the story is I actually currently work right now as not only as an independent sort of educator and consultant, but I work for a management consulting firm where I'm partly responsible for crafting messaging for different companies and also helping them make good decisions. And I view it as a kind of applied philosophy in the sense that I'm trying to learn how to help people improve the quality of their decision-making and thinking, if not at an individual level, then at an institutional level. So it's all part of one piece.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. So before we really take a deep dive, what is tribalism? Because some people aren't familiar with that term.
Right. And it's okay, because a lot of these terms, what commonly used terms actually are used in different senses. And that's okay. It's kind of a mistake, I think, to try to stipulate a single meaning for a term when in fact there are multiple meanings in use. And people use them for different purposes. So when I talk about tribalism, I want to stipulate a specific meaning for a specific purpose. So I want to talk about this way in which our group identities impact the way we make moral judgments and impact the way we make epistemological judgments or judgments about knowledge or rationality. So in that sense, I think of just a tribe as just a social group with which we identify based on some characteristic. It can be kind of arbitrary. It could be religion, it could be ethnicity, it could be a shared interest in the sports team, right? All these different ways in which we can identify with a group. And then tribalism is a set of behaviors and attitudes that are associated with this identification with that tribe. So part of the process involves identification with a tribe. It gives us a sense of who us is, who we are, our group identity, in contrast to some defined other, some of them. So it sets up an us-them distinction. And so this set of tribal behaviors and attitudes has to do with, on the one hand, moral judgments. We tend to think that judgments of our tribe are better, are more justified, more reasonable, and that judgments of those outside the tribe are somehow compromised, or they're more ignorant, or they're worse people. They have worse motives, and so on, so on. And then there's this epistemological side, or the kind about knowledge, where we tend to view ourselves as holding the reasonable standpoint. Like we're connected to the facts and we understand things well. And the other side, when they differ from us, it's because they are either ignorant, or they're cognitively compromised in some way, or like blinded, or they're biased, or they've been fed a bunch of lies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's that set of pattern of associations, both in our judgments about the moral status of our own actions and judgments versus other people, and the status of the rationality of other people, that I call tribalism, or I should say that's tribal psychology. And that's the sense in which I'm using it. If you ask anthropologists or cognitive scientists or other sorts of professionals how they might use that term, they might use a different set of terms. Some people often will also, what I call tribalism, they'd call kind of negative tribalism or highly polarized tribalism. So they'll focus on the negative stuff and call that tribalism, but I'm not doing that.
So when we talk about tribes, this is inherent to us, right? We don't seek, we do seek people within that tribe, but it's at a very subconscious level. So let's talk about the history of that, because you were talking about anthropology, but it's rooted in our DNA. So what are the benefits? Because I think we're seeing a lot of the negative side effects of tribalism today, especially, and you talk about, and we'll talk about later, the extent of polarization and how that affects whether tribalism is going that direction of quote unquote negative, in a sense, less cooperation. I guess we could say that. But where does it stem from? Why do we gravitate towards tribes?
Well, I think that story has to do with the evolution of our distinctive species. Homo sapiens is a social species, and it's not just a social species, it's an ultra social species. And when anthropologists use that term, they mean something like when we form groups and we work together in groups, and these are groups not just tied together by kinship or genetic relatedness, which often happens in animal communities, right? Where you have tribes that are associated, where there's some kind of mating going on amongst them. So, but we can make tribal groups with humans that include strangers, like in a city where it's not just my local community that I'm interacting with, but people who may be part of of a city that I identify with, but are actually strangers to me. And yet I can feel a sense of connection to them, a sense of obligation toward them. And so we can identify at that level, and we can identify at that level in a way that we can perform coordinated social acts together toward common goals. So that's ultra sociality, and we're that kind of species. And it's a secret of our success. It's a secret of our genius as a species, why we are so, we're not all that impressive physically compared to other animals who are stronger and faster and otherwise more dangerous than us. But when you put us together in groups, and those groups have a kind of cognitive division of labor and an actual division of labor. So we've got different parts of the group performing different actions. Like if you're a hunting group, in some hunter-gatherer, scenario, we split up and we have a coordinated system where some member of the tribe performs one action and others do others in a coordinated way to take down the mammoth or whatever. And that's very unusual in the animal world to have that kind of differentiation. But it's essential to our human form of sociality. So survival among groups requires this intense relationship to others, to groups. That's probably the basis of how we formed language, of our distinctively natural kind. It's probably the basis of why we have the big brains we do, because of the demands of social living impose that. A new kind, being able to keep track of all these coordinated things, be able to model the mental states of other members. So when you look at that thing and point over there, I know that you're thinking about that object. And I know that about you. So my mental of you includes a model of your mental state. There's no other animal that does this the way that we do it, right? And it's all in the service of coordinated social activity. So as a byproduct of this, we absolutely need to belong to groups. It's a survival necessity. And so we have developed an instinct for belonging to groups, where if we are not felt accepted and part of a group, then we are highly at risk.
Mm-hmm.
We are at risk of social isolation. The risk of social isolation is, in an ancestral environment, extremely high, like fatal, right? You
Yeah.
just don't survive on your own. And in our modern context, when you think about how that plays out, we have a lot more ability to survive quasi-independently, right? But we have this deep instinct to belong, so that, when we talk about the epidemic of loneliness, that's a feature of sort of modern social life and is maybe getting worse. That loneliness, I think of, and other loneliness experts think of it by analogy with something like hunger, where your body needs food, sustenance, and it sends a signal to your brain that you're going to be compromised unless you seek out food. Well, loneliness is that feeling that we have when our social needs are compromised, when we need to seek out belonging because we need the emotional and other kinds of support that belonging to a group means. And so it should feel uncomfortable to us as an adaptation. The loneliness is something we try to alleviate by joining groups. And so that's just part of the conceptual scheme I think I have for this. It's fairly consistent with what a lot of psychologists think about it. Belongingness is treated as a fundamental psychological need on a par with other core psychological needs now. So it's no surprise that we have a natural instinct to seek out and bond with social groups. But now we have, in a modern context, we have so many types to choose from now, and so much access, especially through the internet. It really has a very unique moment in our history that we have the opportunity to connect with as many different tribal groups as we can. I think that probably is a source of confusion for us.
Yeah, and I think too, when it comes to loneliness, we're in a society that has become very egocentric, at least in Western culture, right? It's about the self first, then other people, where I feel like Eastern culture is more putting others first, and then we come last. And we sometimes forget, living in a first world country, that all the things we have takes other people, but because we don't see them, we flip on a switch, we turn on the faucet, water comes out. We don't think of all the people that it takes to make that happen. So we get into that mindset, well, we don't need anyone else. And then the people that we do connect with, again, have those set of beliefs, whether it's religious, political, and we stick to those, but then we forget about all the people that may not fit into that specific tribe that we also are relying on every single day.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are we talked about the benefits of tribalism, the feeling of connectedness and oneness and having those people to rely on, and the fear of not being part of the tribe because of, our ancestors, that could mean life or death if we were rejected. So how does polarization and disconnect play into the more, darker side of tribalism? What are we
Sure.
lacking with that?
Sure. Before I answer that question, I want to add one more point to the first answer, though. Another important element of the benefits of tribalism, or sort of being groupish in our social behaviors, is just about knowledge. It's like most of the knowledge that we have access to is not inside our heads.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the form of books or the internet or other people that we can access socially through it. It's either in the artifacts in our environment or in other people. And we have this unique ability among species to learn new skills and new knowledge, and then we store it in this thing called culture. And it allows us to die, and then new children are born, and they get to access what we learned. It's essentially downloading what we learned from through cultural transmission of knowledge and skills passed on. Lots of animals have a kind of cultural transmission, but nothing quite like ours. Ours is distinctive. And so one set of illusions that we live under is that we think we're so smart and we know all the stuff. But if you ask us to explain how things work in the world, we quickly realize we're very limited in our understanding of even how basic things work. But we don't have to know these things to be functional because we have this distributed collective set of behaviors and systems set up so that when we need to know something, we sort of access it in the environment as opposed to have it all memorized or internalized.
True.
So that's another sense in which our groupishness is an enormous asset. And we don't want to eliminate those parts of our human identity that make that possible, right?
True.
But it's part and parcel of the same set of social psychological attributes. Anyway, so that's one point I wanted to include in there, because I'm a tribalist. Some people think that I'm an anti-tribalist. I've been called this. I'm not a joiner. I talk a lot about the risks of joining up with political identity groups or ideological groups, that it compromises our critical thinking skills. I have a whole line on that, which I believe somehow that's supposed to make me an anti-tribalist. But no, in fact, I'm a strong proponent of the importance of collective social identity, and many of the distinctively human and great things about us are tied to that social nature. So I'm not an anti-tribalist, but as you said, polarization is a really important topic. And those are different. That's different from tribal psychology. So I view polarization as some measure of the distances between social groups, how different they are. And so you can measure it on any number of dimensions, ideological, or how tall people are, or what their preferences are for music. And so you can imagine how close one group is to another versus how far apart they are on some metric.
Classical music versus hard, heavy metal
would be farther apart than different shades of classical. Right. So polarization is a measure of not just of how different groups are, but most importantly, perhaps, how different the groups are perceived to be by the members themselves. So if I'm a person within a group and I ask myself about that group over there, that individuals in that group over there, how similar or different are they to me? My answer will reflect my understanding of those differences. And if I think they're very different from me, like very different, versus to some other group that's much less different, I will have a whole different set of behaviors and attitudes directed toward them than the other group. Because the perceived polarization is so high. And effectively, I mean, the problem is that if you imagine degrees of polarization as like the regions of overlap of our different bubbles, of our different tribal bubbles. Mm-hmm. And if they're like a Venn diagram almost, right? Where if there's a lot of overlap, then the quality of our relationships is just different. And especially when it comes to the quality of our ability to disagree with each other. We can have conversations, we can be friendly, we can disagree, but I never once challenge your entitlement to be treated like a person, or respect for your ability to reason about these issues. I might disagree, I might get heated, but there isn't a breakdown in our ability to recognize each other as, moral agents, rational agents, and so on.
One thing I think about when you say that is, for example, let's use the Christian faith, right? But you have all these denominations. So you have Methodist and Catholic and Lutheran and Baptist. So those are very different within themselves, but they all fall under the umbrella of Christianity. So while they have disagreements, they still agree on one thing. They're Christian, right? Is that versus the difference of someone who's Muslim versus Christian, or atheist versus Christian?
Well, if you treat it as an objective measure of differences, then that's one way of talking about it. And you could say that in this case, there are fewer differences between different Protestant denominations than between any of those and, say, Islam or Buddhism. Uh, but but as I said, the sort of psychological attitude one has can vary widely. So within a particular Protestant denomination, you could have a fairly intense form of ideological attachment to that particular denomination. And it is not uncommon, for example, for certain hardcore Protestants to think that, for example, Catholics are not Christian, right? They are of a different order entirely. And so, I mean, they will say that. And then for someone who comes from a kind of religious studies background, who sees all of this as different denominations within a larger Christian, structure, that's a shocking thing to hear. What do you mean Catholics aren't Christian? They're just a different type of Christian. But they'll go, oh, no, no, no. Here's real Christianity.
Mm.
And they're some kind of false or ersatz kind of Christianity. So it says, okay. So that's they view themselves as highly polarized, right? Maybe as highly polarized as Islam is to them.
Interesting.
So the internal perception is maybe a strong, maybe the more important measure, rather than some objective measure of difference or distance. It really matters how you feel about it, how different you think you are from them.
Right.
That's what matters. I mean, you have, and there's so few constraints on this. You can have, for example, tribal animosities in African villages or African nations that go back where the external, you can't see a visual difference in ethnicity among the people who are warring, but they see themselves as very different because of a certain set of cultural, ethnic, religious history. And so what matters there is again, their interpretation of their identity as opposed to some objective set of measures, right?
Yeah.
And we know how this varies. It's interesting, like in the US, the difference between people who will identify as white versus black or white versus people of color is like any shade off of a particular kind of normative Caucasian is regarded as a person of color, which includes this huge rainbow of colors spectrum, right? That's a distinctively kind of American division. Whereas if you go to Africa, the divisions are much different. So a lot of it's cultural. How you make the division, learn the division, recognize it is itself something that's learned often. And it's probably just a generally important point. That you can learn them, and then you can also unlearn them, which is an optimistic feature. But the real threat, of course, is that when you see yourself as very, very alien from another group, their behavior is regarded as irrational or evil or motivated by the worst intentions, then that licenses all sorts of behaviors against them that you would never allow yourself to do to members of one's own tribe. And there you get racism and bigotry and intolerance and genocide in the worst cases, right?
Right.
Where, dehumanization. Those are the worst cases, and they're all kind of a byproduct of really excessive polarization.
I think it's interesting the way you were talking about, you were saying that you were not anti-tribalism, but some people view you that way. And I think a lot of people, whenever we try to, because I try to come from a very objective perspective and try to see both sides to a situation. Now, that doesn't mean that I won't gravitate more towards one side than the other, but I will try to at least hear the other side out or look at their lines of reasoning and then make my own decision. In certain cases, I do kind of sit in the middle where I can see the pros and cons of both situations. But a lot of people do not like, they call you fence sitters, right? Indecisive. You need to choose one or the other because it's almost like they can't trust you if they don't know whose side you're on or which side you're on. So why is it that that that's seen as more of a negative versus a positive, being objective, because we say as a society we like people who are open-minded and able to see both sides to a story or change their perspective on something once they've obtained new information. I don't know if you got to the part in the book about Julie Zimmerman, about the it was all over she wrote an article in the Atlantic where she saw a 2-minute clip of a situation, and then the next day she saw the 2-hour clip of that same situation, and she said, now that I have this new information, my perspective's changed. And she got backlash from both sides whenever she did that. And I feel like that's what we need in a society that is so divided, is someone like that to bring us together and be objective.
I remember that story, and I remember reading about it in the book again. And yes, it's interesting, this genre of people talking about places where they've changed their mind, and they're viewed as kind of heroes by some of us. When you tell the story about, I used to believe this and I was very dogmatic about it, and then afterwards, upon reflection and so on, I changed my mind. And we all go clap, 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 right?
Some people.
Well, it's to your point. Yeah, there's a division of attitude towards it. If you're very partisan on the issue, then you're going to say, well, you were right the first time, but you're wrong now, or you were always wrong, but there is this group of people who now view that kind of humility and willingness to change as a rarity, enough of a rarity that it's worth applauding, right? It's not normalized because it stands out because we see it so rarely. So especially in the media, where most of the media has been structured to be partisan. So we're seeing one story hammered over again and again from a certain perspective. You don't see those people. Fox News nor CNN is going to have people who are editorial spokespersons for that, the line they've been pushing for years, all of a sudden just go, I'm probably wrong about that. They can't. There's far too much social pressure. That is a form of tribalism as well. That sense that I am, and it speaks to the original question about what's the social dynamic going on here, and it's a persuasion dynamic. It is rather than a kind of get to the truth dynamic, and because we know what sorts of virtues are necessary for truth-seeking behavior, finding out the facts. You've got to be somewhat dispassionate. You've got to be flexible to do evidence. You've got to be willing to revise your account in the face of new evidence. You've got to question assumptions. You've got to check your own bias, all these things. Which makes your positions necessarily tentative at every stage of the process. They're open to change. But that set of attitudes is not generally valued in terms of social persuasion. If I'm trying to get somebody to accept some policy initiative, or persuade the voters to vote on this healthcare package, or persuade us to go to war or not go to war over a particular topic, or who to vote for the next election, those are regarded as social persuasion contexts where the goal is to persuade, not necessarily to persuade for good reasons. Usually, if it's highly partisan, the people who are on each group already think their reasons are good. Their goal is to make change. Their goal is to essentially have a specific outcome. And so the context is about social change and social influence. And when that's the context, you just need the smart thing from that point of view is to be one-sided, to be fairly dogmatic, to strawman the opponent's positions, to cast them as suspicious or otherwise. All those things that we think of as negative, those are smart things from a social persuasion standpoint. They are effective. And so you're thinking more like a soldier mentality than like a scientist mentality, where our goal is to win the battle, not to work out the ideological issues around our difference. Once we have set our goal is that we're in conflict with this group and we have to beat them, then the parameters have changed.
But do you feel like that's benefiting us as a society today when we have so much discord? Like, I understand it's definitely beneficial and, the power of persuasion and how that works in our society. But because we are so polarized and people are filtering all of this information that not all of it is factual, do you think that urge to be more persuasive and right, to win that battle, is benefiting the future of our of humanity?
It's a big topic, right? No, I would say no. The way in which this is playing out right now, this sort of heightened period of polarization, where lots of things are being sucked up into a political, ideological tornado. Almost, it feels like there's this whirlwind going on, and there's these social forces that are impacting speech and impacting I guess the incentive structure for speech and political action is such that you can be very severely punished for saying the wrong things to the wrong people.
Right.
And you can be highly rewarded by these other groups. So these reward punishment thing is set up where your tribal identities are associated with. Within my tribe, I get a lot of support for saying these things that supports the tribe's standpoint. I am their champion. I'm fighting the good fight. They support all that. And so for me, I have this whole positive incentive structure for being someone who is advocating for a certain viewpoint. And I think it's bad on a number of reasons. One is it distorts. Well, this is where I get in the issue that I think any form of strong ideological identification narrows our critical thinking ability. So we end up having a distorted view of the other side. We end up having a distorted view of reality because it colors our interpretation of the facts. And it ends up distorting our own view of ourselves often as well. Mm-hmm. So it's a kind of blinder that makes us that is adaptive in the sense that given the goals of winning a certain kind of ideological war, it's useful to think of the other side as less than, as the irrational, villains. Villains, right? That's almost a precondition for that, just as it is with other kinds of human conflict, like war. Like part of the natural state of getting soldiers and countries in a position where they're comfortable waging war against some other opponent is a kind of systematic dehumanization of the enemy, so that things that we could never think of doing to them in their ordinary course of affairs all of a sudden become reasonable, acceptable things to do. It's a playbook that has to be run. You have to dehumanize the enemy. You have to do these things. Otherwise, soldiers have to be trained hard for them to be in the position to do this. We've made it easier and easier with sort of long distance warfare, but then the public has to be behind it as well. And so you essentially have, sponsored propaganda campaigns to get the public to support an initiative because they have to make the other side be perceived as a real threat.
Right.
And all of that has a certain kind of natural logic to it. It's not surprising, but we seem to be to deploy it in so many non-essential ways. We want to be able to deploy that kind of coordinated thing if there's a very serious real threat. right?
Right.
Then we want to be able to recognize the threat for what it is and collectively coordinate ourselves so we can stop that threat. But what we have is this weird fractioning of every little issue gets
Right.
treated like that by some, it's like a nested set of little wars where the war psychology is the active psychology. And the sort of scientist psychology or the critical thinking psychology only has room to operate in the interstitial areas between these overlapping kind of war zones. If you can imagine my visual model here of all these sort of bubbles that are sort of tribally charged areas of social action and attitudes. And within those bubbles, you are the incentive structure to go along with the tribe and to demonize the other side is really high. So to escape that, you've got to kind of exit yourself from a bubble and maybe find these other little bubbles of people who think the way you do too. Maybe like you and I talking right now are part of one of those bubbles. Mm-hmm. But it's like we have to have room, and there's less room within the broader public, the broader society, to have those attitudes be acceptable because there's so much. It's so much like I think of these as sort of using the mathematical notion of an attractor, where there's a naturally stable ideas get sucked into whatever the local attractor is. And it's really hard to release an idea into this environment and fly to its target without getting blown off course by the sort of ideological winds or the social, the polarized winds shifting back and forth, or get sucked into some narrative where what you said is interpreted by some group one way or interpreted by another group another way. So it even compromises our ability to say what we mean. To speak in this environment is to involve distorting our ability to be understood. So we have to, it's one of the reasons why I say very little on social media. Yeah. Because those environments are ones where I cannot control the interpretation of what I say.
Exactly.
It will get distorted in a second. Exactly. And I would rather have a place where I get to, I have maybe the privilege of this, but to be able to write down something carefully, thoughtfully, have a place where people can look it up and read it, and I get to control that narrative.
It's like gravity.
I don't think this is good.
It's like gravity, and where it may be a solar system of all these little planets, thinking of the tribes, that have a gravitational pull, but you can escape it, versus a black hole that now we're getting sucked into, and it's very difficult to escape that black hole because of the polarization and the density to that.
I like these little gravitational wells. And another important feature of this, if you want to play with this model a little bit, of these tribal bubbles, the more kind of intense they are, the more certain things are true about them. One of them is the idea that complexity is unstable within these bubbles. And what I mean by that is when there's an issue where there is, pros and cons on either side, and the arguments for and against may well be compelling. And you recognize it's actually a complex issue, like nuclear power. Is it safe or unsafe? Well, it's got these virtues and it's got these vices, these pros, these cons, and it's a tricky thing to get at. Or policy around borders and immigration. It's a complex issue. There's pros and cons. I kind of see the point of view. That kind of complexity, which usually is a sign that you're seeing a broader picture. Mm-hmm. You are seeing the broader, the landscape of values, and the landscape of consequences of a certain policy. You actually have a more accurate picture of the world. But it's not obvious what you should do. It's not obvious what the next action step should be when you're confronting complexity. In those environments, that is an unstable situation to be in a polarized environment where the whole goal is to be action oriented. You want to do something. So in order to be able to justify a choice to act, say, in accordance with the ideology, you have simplified the description of reality. It can't be that it's one side, the other side. It's got to be one side has terrible arguments and your side has great arguments.
Otherwise, you'd have paralysis by analysis, right?
Exactly. So this is an unstable, when I say complexity is unstable, which means in those bubbles, we go for simple analyses of of our situation. And they are adaptive because they allow for action, uncomplicated, quick responses to things. We know what the next thing is to say and do.
Right.
But it is often unmoored from reality, or it's at the cost of totally misrepresenting the views of the opposition. That's the situation. I see it over and over. This description of even the best little bit of a bit admitting the complexity of a social policy issue. If you're in an ideologically polarized tribe, that idea has to be squelched right away. It's got to be a strong pro or a strong con, nothing in between.
Yeah.
And all subtlety and all that stuff is marginalized, is pushed out. And that's where I think where a lot of the people who are in these interstitial tribes, these sort of critical thinking oriented, let's not be, our judgment be clouded by this tribal stuff, have been marginalized from those groups. They don't want to be compromised in that way. They want to be able to talk about the nuance, and there's no place to do it there. So they have to find their own space.
Right. Yeah. And tying this back to emotional intelligence, self-awareness specifically, we have to become aware of our innate need to be a part of a group, but also looking at the pros and the cons. We kind of have to be that person that analyzes this and says, is this helping me or hurting me? Because there's family members who voted for the opposite person, from whom I voted for, and that caused a massive strain in our relationship, which is amazing when you think about it, that this is your flesh and blood, but a difference in opinion on public figures who you support can cause that much of a strain and almost complete divorce from that family member, right? So having this self-awareness. So what do you think is a good strategy for us to be able to break free of that gravitational pull, if you will, from the polarization that it brings?
It's a tough one, right? Because it requires probably like a multi-pronged approach. I do like basic education as a foundation around this issue. So learning about the psychology. If someone was to absorb everything in Jonathan Haidt's books, right? The Righteous Mind and others, or the others in that genre that talk about our moral psychology. And that alone, if you were to understand those principles, those ideas, it would be eye-opening. It would hopefully help to make one reflect upon our instinctive judgments and make us want to find perspectives that we can look at relationships and our own reactions and things from a bit of a distance. The other set of skills, and I know this is also part of the emotional intelligence community sort of set of applied things, is the set of therapeutic kind of practices. Mindfulness is one of them. So you become more aware of your own reactions, your own mental state, how you're responding to things. You want to be able to move to a point where you're not simply reacting, but you're responding. Right. From a place of sort of considered judgment rather than bam, right, that reflex. And part of it is becoming attuned to those, pathways.
Right. Recalibrating a bit.
Recalibrating, slow thinking, being able to do that. Those are hard to do because some of that is I think, tied to, personality traits that can be hard to shift for some people, or they have deeper roots, Also being part of groups, right? So much of our ability to behave in the ways we want can be affected by the groups and environments in which we are situated. I do believe that character traits are much more contextual than people tend to think. I think I think this is consistent with the psychology of character as well, that when we think of character as a disposition to behave in a certain way under a certain environment, if I say Tom is an honest person, Generally, it means I'll predict that Tom is going to behave in certain ways in certain situations that display the trait of honesty. But it's tempting to think of that trait of honesty as like an intrinsic feature of Tom that follows him around no matter what environment he's in.
Right.
And I think there's tons of evidence that character doesn't work this way. That is, it's much more like if you think about a chessboard as being like the character traits are intrinsic for you. Like you have a rook that moves up this way, up and down and across. And then the bishop moves along diagonal. Those are intrinsic behaviors that are intrinsic to the piece. They're always the same no matter where they are on the board or who they're next to. Human beings aren't quite like that. It's much more like if you had a chess piece that had a basic set of moves, but when you moved it next to another piece, the set of moves changes because of its proximity or to other pieces around it. So imagine this really complicated version of chess, like it's contextual chess. You make a piece, you move it over, then all of a sudden the things it can do or is disposed to do is a function of not only of its intrinsic properties, but also the intrinsic properties of the other pieces in its configuration around it and the relationships they have on the board. So all of a sudden, it's not just a function of me, it's a function of the other person plus this set of associations that we're in, the configuration that we're in. Then that's the thing that determines what I can do or what I'm disposed to do. And this is like, Tom's at home, he's always a certain kind of guy, but in a work environment, he's stealing paper every day. And he's lying about his work performance. But in other contexts, he would never dream of being that dishonest. Right? So his disposition is highly contextual. Character is like
very
this.
True.
Hitler and other sorts of, horrible people still have these pockets in their social lives where they have norms of behavior that we would recognize as being good. And then these other areas where they're awful, that kind of compartmentalization is extreme in those cases, but we all exhibit it to a certain extent. And recognizing that in ourselves is a kind of emotional, I think it helps our emotional intelligence to come to realize that one of the ways I can make myself a better person is to change my environment, because it's not just up to me. Right. It's not through an act of will alone, like heroic act of self-transformation, that I make myself this better person. Because our behavior is also a function of these contextual things. So change my context, and all of a sudden, these other behaviors become natural, become a part of the norm because of the dependency. So if you can figure it out, how that works, like curiosity, for example, I know you wrote about the importance of, in terms of mindset, of adopting an attitude of actual curiosity towards other people and subject matters. It's so helpful. Well, they've done studies of this, and you can put people in a group of 5 curious people, and all of a sudden they become more curious because of the social impact of being around people who exhibit that trait, right?
Yeah, very true. I mean, even with weight, because they say if you have friends like who are in really good shape, and let's say you're overweight, but you spend time around those people, they don't have to tell you about their diet or exercise regimen.
Right.
But because you're around them, you actually can lose weight being around those people. So that's very true. And going back to what you were saying before about character traits, I think there's so many things in life that we attach as part of our identity that are really just beliefs and indoctrinations. But whenever we attach that as who we are and not what we've been raised to believe, then it's harder to break free of those beliefs because we feel like we're losing a part of who we are. So I think we have to start separating that as detach that from our identity and see it as just that. It's belief systems. If we were raised somewhere else, we would have a completely different system of beliefs and potentially character traits.
And it can be a product of your contingent history. Like you have early childhood trauma around something, or you have abandonment issue, or you have some other kind of thing, and you end up having some core set of beliefs around which there's a protective shell, like a trigger. Like
Mm-hmm.
as soon as those are threatened, that is perceived as a threat to your identity, and you're immediately defensive and protective, right? You're not open to the, entertaining options, alternatives, because you feel that if those are under threat, you lose who you are. Who am I then if I'm not this?
Right.
Right. And people have those, I think we all have those in some places inside us. And being able to recognize that, being able to see where we are, where in our shell of beliefs, some of them are just totally inconsequential. Like, it doesn't matter to me if I said, I think I said this in a video somewhere, if I said some actor was born in a certain country and someone said, no, I don't think she was. And I'm like, okay, I'll probably take your word for it. Maybe we'll look it up on Wikipedia or something. I'm not going to defend it because it doesn't matter to me. If I'm wrong about that, it doesn't matter. But then if you go a little bit closer to something that does matter, like maybe my judgments about healthcare policy, let's say, I actually do think there's something at stake here if I'm wrong about this, or immigration policy, then if it matters more to me about if it matters more to me if I'm wrong, then I'm more likely to be critical of perspectives, be wanting to defend it, but still be open. It'll take more than someone's say so
Right.
to move me on this, right? And then as you get real close to this inner core, all of a sudden, it's quite a heroic act if I change my mind on that. You shouldn't expect that to happen. You should be, the prescription for addressing people in terms of their core beliefs issues is, I think, I call it the Indiana Jones swap. In the first movie, when Indiana Jones has to steal in the opening scene, has to steal the gold statue
Mm-hmm.
off the tablet, and he has to, if he leaves it off, he's going to get shot with arrows or something.
Right.
She's going to trigger some defense mechanism, right? So he has to have this bag of sand, whatever, that is the same weight, and he's got to swap them out quickly so that the system doesn't know that you've changed something, and so it doesn't trigger the defense mechanism. So imagine someone's core identity as being, say, a devout Catholic, right? And if you think you're going to engage with that person in a way that challenges them on that point, when it's core to them, you should be prepared to that to be a failed process. But also, the only case it'll work is if there is some other set of beliefs that can be moved into place that can perform the same role in terms of grounding someone's identity in the same way that did. Otherwise, it'll collapse. Otherwise, you fragment someone.
Right.
You destroy their identity, which is a horrible outcome, right? So swap it out. And that almost never happens.
No.
And if it does happen, it happens sort of one little brick at a time.
And I think that's where our approach is. Our initial approach is to change someone's mind, to persuade someone that they are wrong and we are right, instead of modeling certain behaviors. And then they have that new information to take into account. They feel less threatened. We're not a threat to them. We're not trying to change them, but they start to see this alternative perspective. I don't know if you know, have you heard of Daryl Davis?
No.
I recommend that you check him out. I think you'd be very intrigued by his story, but he lives in the US. He's an international blues musician, but he's also an activist. And he was a military brat, and his parents worked for the embassy, the US embassy. So he lived all around the world. And being an African American, I think he was like 10 years old. I believe this, I could be wrong. I believe this was in the 60s. But he was in a parade when he was 10, and he was holding the American flag and marching. And all of a sudden, he started being hit with debris from spectators in this group of parade viewers. And at first, he was like, these people must hate the Scouts, because that was the group he was marching with. And it wasn't until his Scout leaders came and surrounded him and took him out of that situation that he realized that it wasn't the Scouts, it was him that they were attacking. And that was the first time he had ever experienced racism. So a lot of us, when we would have an experience like that and experienced hate from an outside group, that may influence a certain, what is the word I'm looking for? Resentment towards that group, right?
Mm-hmm.
But instead, he formed this question at a very young age of 10 years old. How can you hate me when you don't even know me? And he wanted to answer that question. So he started reading up on white supremacy and racism and neo-Nazism and all of these things. And he said, it still never answered my question. I learned a lot about them and never answered my question. So then he started to attend as an observer KKK rallies. This Black man, going to these KKK rallies, and he met with a Klan leader. Never tried to convince these people that they were wrong, ever, but just asked questions and got to know their perspective and point of view. And then he began to befriend these people. And it took years for some of them,
Mm-hmm.
but over the course of this time, he has influenced over 200 KKK members to turn in their robes, denounce racism, all from him coming from a place of understanding and modeling a behavior that I am not what you perceive to be true. And the majority of us are not that stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that if we all approached it that way, coming from a place of understanding, being curious about the other side, and then just simply modeling a behavior that goes against that held stereotype without trying to convince, we would be able to find that commonality that we need in life.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the lessons of those kinds of examples is that attitude change, what those core at that core level is a marathon and not a sprint,
Mm-hmm.
right? You should be imagining this is the long game, and I do think I recognize this individual from your
Yeah. I've heard
description
about
of him.
them.
But these are cases of, and a lot of cases, reports of people who've left hate groups. We talk about their relationships that helped them do that as being one of acceptance by someone from the out group that they otherwise have been taught to demonize. And they just accept them, and they're just curious, and they don't really try to change minds, but they're just sort of inviting them to be a part of their lives. And then once they accept that thing, then it's this gradual process of this relationship causing me to reassess my understanding, because at every point you're violating the stereotype that I have been taught in an
Right.
ongoing way. And it is a testimony to how resilient the stereotype is, that you don't change things right away. But one counterexample, mind you, as a matter of brute rationality, one counterexample doesn't necessarily undermine a generalization, right? So one can hold on to the saying, think that, oh, most people like you are going to be like X, even though you're different. Right. That's one way of people, maintaining racist beliefs, even though they end up having relationships that are friendly with people from some other group, because they think, well, you're the exceptions, and I'm not really including you. So that's a kind of, cognitive dissonance. That
You do hear that a lot, though. You do hear that a lot, that, well, you're the exception. I've heard that about other groups before, too. Well, I really like so-and-so, but they're so different. But then the question is, but how many people have you interacted and engaged with as intensely as you have this person? Where are you getting this information from? From the media? Does the media portray the majority or the minority? Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's I tend to be sympathetic to people who are really raised in certain cultures where there are some definite attitudes, which we now from the outside, you'd say, well, that's a racist or a sexist or whatnot set of ideas. And when you go out in the world, you're going to encounter, different viewpoints, and you're going to need to change your mind in them at some point. I do feel sympathy for that, because that process is not easy. It wouldn't be easy for any of us. And,
Right.
and So I don't get much mileage out of condemning someone's,
Right.
initial resistance, right? What's the point of that? That's human nature. Of course they're going to resist.
And we don't know what we don't know. If we've never been exposed and we're seeing that group or ideology as a threat, then why would we want to be open to that? I
Mhm.
mean, like you said, um, you have to be sympathetic and empathetic to their situations, but at the same time, there's a difference between ignorance, a lack of knowledge, and then having that knowledge, having that exposure, and then still coming from that place of hatred towards that group.
Mhm.
Would you agree?
Mhm. Mhm. It's these are hard questions to to assess. Well, one of the objections you'll hear from, if you interpret the way our attitude that we're voicing here as a kind of tolerance for the intolerant, because that's important for making it reasonable to expect them to change their mind over time, is otherwise you're just going to reinforce their, if you fight fire with fire, they're going to reinforce their perception of you. So this attitude of acceptance and tolerance for intolerance is a kind of noble ideal, and there are cases where it works. But from another side, another standpoint, the politically active side is like, that's an indulgence. It's been how many decades, centuries, that our particular social group has been handicapped here, and and it's okay for us to insist on change, even when it upsets people, and whatever we're going to take our our rightful entitlements and affirm ourselves and support ourselves. So this is where you get political activism that has a much more stronger stance to it. The rhetoric is stronger. It's much more uncompromising. Um, and within those social groups, the rhetoric is viewed as a representation of dignity. Like, I'm going to assert my entitlement to be treated with respect, to be recognized as an equal, regardless of whether you recognize it or not. And I'm going to create a space where that's possible, and I'm going to insist that society recognize that. So that's activism. You got to respect that too, because a lot of
Oh yeah,
powerful changes happen
100%.
on the back of that.
And I agree. I mean, and I see that. I don't think that it's fair to not have those same rights, right? And that's where it's like people can hear what I'm saying and misconstrue it, right? Because I like, for example, with African American and the African American community and systemic racism, I see that it exists, right? And I do believe that everyone deserves the same rights. And I do believe that a lot of people, regardless of whether it's labeled as having the right rights, do not have that. But I also have family members who were brought up racist, right? And haven't been exposed. And so while I completely disagree with their ideology and their mindset, it's trying to find, if possible, that balance, like Daryl Davis did, was saying, I don't agree with you. I think you're completely wrong in your approach and how you view me. But I also know that by condemning you, I'm not going to change your way of thinking. Right. So it's kind of like, yes, there needs to be drastic change. So you have the activist. But at the same time, and that changes, I feel like, policy more so than at an individual level. Whereas Daryl Davis's approach is he's definitely an activist, but he also changes people at their core,
One person at a time.
one person at a time, from a different approach,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, I like this hierarchical model, by the way. This idea that social change, because societies and social phenomena are multi-level phenomena. They're grounded in part in human nature and individual personalities, and they also have a set of causes that operate at a higher level of organization that are social, and then even broader than that, you've got historical factors and other, even maybe global factors at some point. Global, geopolitical stuff can have an impact on the color of our lives. So the hierarchy is there. It's probably a mistake to think that that the root cause is at one level or the other, right? So it's probably a mistake. And I think maybe those of us who were really keen on rationality, critical thinking, emotional intelligence, mindfulness, critical self-reflection, our mistake when we make a mistake is thinking there's putting too much emphasis on the individual and thinking modeling change, thinking of driving social change by driving individual change first, as though it had to be bottom up like that. So that's this kind of change one heart, one mind at a time approach, and the whole thing will spread. And the reality is probably that they have this multi-level phenomenon. And when you do political activism also at the higher levels, at the group level, that can have these dramatic, fast changes, like how quickly, for example, gay marriage became a minority view to a majority view within the U.S. context. A small number of years after many decades of social work, how quickly, most recently, the Black Lives Matter movement in relationship to that, it came up over the past few months during the pandemic, and how that has produced this sort of phase change in social attitude or social norms, about large cultural groups now signing on to the need for some kind of a reform in their practices and their attitudes. Bam! It's like there was a social tipping point, right, that happened. And it may well be that these individual relationships where we're sort of changing one heart one mind at a time is a necessary, maybe precondition, but it's not sufficient in some cases. That is, social dynamics play a role here. There's sort of a collective, it's part of our tribal identity. We are sensitive to how the rest of our social tribes feel. And if everyone in my group says it's okay to do that now, all of a sudden, boom, a switch goes on, because I'm responding. My social IQ is that now all of a sudden what used to be a risky stance to take is now socially acceptable.
Oh, that's a really good point. That's a really good point, because it's not necessarily always top down or bottom up. It's coming from both ends. But at the same time, I think about how, society, this is how you should think, this is what you should believe, right? And like you were saying, if our entire tribe changes their ideology or way of thinking, then we adopt that because we are part of that tribe. However, I think that it's also important for us to understand why and come from a deeper level so we can start to embody that ourselves instead of just following the tides, right?
I agree with that 100%. In fact, that would be a great model for, the understanding where you go from social, local, individualistic, and then even sub-individual. That is, at some point, and I'm sure that you would agree with this, there's a perspective on a level of description of human behavior where really what we're talking about is the orchestration of dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and whatever the neurochemicals and hormones that regulate attitudes and behavior, the strongest things. So literally some level of description that's sort of micro neurochemical. When I now have a positive feeling toward you that I didn't have before, what that is some kind of new orchestration of my internal state that makes me feel good in your presence. That feels, whereas there was some other orchestration of chemicals that made it struck fear and anxiety or distrust or whatever. That was the interpretation before.
Yeah.
And so that's very micro, right? You wouldn't want to do social policy trying to do that, trying to engineer everyone's, serotonin levels around. But it is, the set of models of human nature that are important for understanding the diversity and the richness, the fullness of who we are, involves models at each of these levels, and multidisciplinary ones. So not just neuro, whatever, but say linguistic, or say some other sorts of, someone who does psychology of emotion from a social science perspective. They probably have a very good mental model that's useful, really kind of useful and insightful under certain perspectives. And someone who does political psychology at a higher level, let's say Karen Stenner, who does political psychology and has written about the authoritarian dynamic as a kind of psychological trait. She does it at this level, and boy, you absorb her model, and all of a sudden you have a new perspective on ourselves and human nature. And there is no one science of human nature. That's just a label, right? That for which you attach all these different disciplinary points of view.
Exactly. Well, that's like NLP. They say the map is not the territory.
Yeah.
Right. And you think of all these different types of maps. You have some that are extremely complex and then some that are very simple. But the reality is taking all of those and layering it on top of one another. Mm-hmm. Right. So we may have a snippet of that reality, but there's all these other dimensions that we're not looking at and honing in on. So yeah.
That's a nice mental model. That's like a meta mental model for learning about a complex subject matter. And if you're talking about emotional intelligence, it's a very nice model because I think it gets exactly the right. What you have is a landscape of different bodies of knowledge that are relevant to understanding this. And the process of becoming literate and then proficient is this process of navigating, exploring different parts of that landscape, coming to understand it better, and then cycling that back and reflecting on it and applying it. How does this relate to me? How does this insight? How can this make an impact on how I behave in the world? But you don't stop there. It's a mistake to think that you've got the single best model here. There's this whole terrain open to you. It doesn't have to stop. You can learn something new, seek out new things. All of a sudden you broaden your perception. And when you learn something new, it can change the way you thought about that other model too. It sort of has this feedback. You go, I see what I was, that was limited in some way here. So it's forward-looking, it's growth-oriented, right? It's not as opposed to static,
right,
which is good. That growth-oriented mindset is positive, is good to cultivate. It's also humbling, in the sense that you can always say, I'm sure I don't have the full story. There's more to learn here. Important role for curiosity, because curiosity is what will drive you to explore those other parts of the landscape. And when you do that, you'll have greater capacity to have a positive influence on the people around you and the world around you. So it's a good meta-mental model.
Yeah. Well, and I also think of like a machine with all these gears, or a watch, and somebody's reality could be one of those gears. They say, well, all the other ones are not necessary because mine's moving, it's making things work. But then you take one other gear out, no matter how small it is or how large it is, and everything stops working. Mm-hmm. Right? So everything feeds into itself to make this one larger component. So, I have really enjoyed this conversation with you, Kevin. And I love seeing, I think philosophy is something that should be taught in schools because it really teaches you to see things from alternative perspectives instead of just finding one truth. So I really enjoyed hearing your, I would say, more holistic perspective. And thank you for kind of breaking down tribalism and how it relates to emotional intelligence. So
it was my pleasure. I enjoyed it very much. I enjoyed your book. I hope it receives a nice wide audience when it's published.
Yes, fingers crossed.
And yeah, thank you very much.
And I will put the link to your website as well as your podcast and your YouTube channel in the description, because gosh, I know it has Ninja in it, and I cannot think of
Argument Ninja.
Argument Ninja. Yes, there we go.
Sure.
So all of that's great, phenomenal resource. So I will definitely put that in the show notes.
Wonderful.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your weekend.
I will. I have a lot of work for me this weekend, so I'm about to get to that myself.
Nice. Well, thank you for taking an extra 30 minutes out of your day to speak.
No problem.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.